talking today to James Wetz, who is the first paid director of human scale education. He spent over 30 years in state education, and 16 of those years were spent as head teacher of 2 different secondary schools. James, what were the origins of this human scale education movement?
The origins of the movement go back quite a long way, and it was set up in the 1980s when Satish Kumar, Anita Roddick, Jonathan Porritt, Maurice Ash and others believed that there was a case for schools on a human scale where relationships were important and where children were known and well known. And it started really with some small independent schools. But in the mid-90s, it branched out and began to work in large state secondary schools, really asking the question, what would a large state school, comprehensive school, look like if it had human-scale behaviours and embedded the human-scale values?
And typically, presumably, one of those comprehensive schools that you were addressing as a problem in the state sector were of what sort of scale and size by that stage?
I wouldn't say that I was addressing them as a problem, but they were schools of around 12 to 1400. They were large schools, one in North Wiltshire and one in inner city Bristol.
Yeah, okay. When was the moment in your career as a teacher that you understood that human scale was important?
Well, it was, in fact, human scale education that introduced me to the small school movement. It offered me an opportunity to go and look at the small school movement in Boston in the United States. And I became, I think, deeply impressed by the engagement that they had created in particularly disadvantaged communities in the States. But I think probably the motivation to get involved after I retired from head teaching in human scale education was that I was actually angry about the number of youngsters who were leaving our schools with few, if any, qualifications. And I began to see that there was a widening gap between those children who were achieving in our schools, and lots do. I mean, I don't want to diminish that, but there is, I don't like to use the word underclass, but there is a significant group of young people who leave school with few qualifications, if any, who have little intention to pursue training or further development for themselves, and who, frankly, have been angered and alienated by the experience of schooling. And for me, if that is happening in large school, if we can create smaller learning environments where we can minimise that happening, that would be a fight worth pursuing.
And what were the different elements of human scale education that would make that engagement with those disaffected pupils?
Well, I think I would perhaps just draw in some research I did in Bristol at the Graduate School of Education there, when we were looking at the particular youngsters who were falling out of school at the age of 16 with absolutely no qualifications at all. And in about 2004-05, there was about 10% of children leaving school in Bristol with no qualifications.
It's a huge number.
It is a huge number. But the interesting thing was, when we actually looked at the stats which the local authority had given us, we found that 40% of that 10% were actually achieved level 4 at Key Stage 2 in English, Maths and or Science. In other words, here was a significant number of children in the city who should have got 5 A to C grades at secondary school, who should have gone into sixth forms, and who should have actually had access to higher and further education, but left school with nothing, and left school with a great deal of anger and disappointment.
But what is it that would draw those people in? Is it people structures? Is it design? Or is it something else?
Well, with the youngsters that we spoke with, and with whom we did some narrative inquiry research, listening to their stories of education, it became clear to me that these were young people who in their small, nurturing primary schools were known and well known, and actually achieved, despite significant environmental and family disadvantage, they actually achieved the academic potential which they had, but in large impersonal secondary schools where it's really difficult to establish that kind of intimacy and connection with children, these youngsters actually fell out. I mean, my belief is that actually these youngsters bring bring a range of attachment difficulties, which, if they're not addressed in the institutional setting, will mean that they are almost institutionally excluded from education.
Therefore, is the key relationship the number of children to teacher ratio?
Yes, it certainly is one of the key factors. When I was a head teacher in a large secondary school, I would give a maths teacher 8 classes to teach a week. Here's the timetable. There are 8 classes. That represents 240 children. I would also ask them to be a tutor for another 30. That's 270 children a week. And there is no way that actually you can know 270 children a week. And what they've done in the States is to downsize that, saying that no teacher should teach more than 75 children a week, and that actually knowing the children is absolutely critical. So the two drivers here are around humanity of scale and the primacy of relationships. How do you bring that into the design of a secondary school?
And what are the different forms that human scale education has taken?
Well, when I was so angry about all this, and Kalous Gulbenkian gave me some money to write a book about it through the university, which I called Urban Village Schools, I looked at the intelligence that I might draw on to inform the design of a secondary school on a human scale. It does seem to me that we need to listen to the marginalised voices of young people who have failed in our school system as we've currently designed it. But we also ought to look at other models. And the models we looked at were the Danish model, where they have a focus scholar system, which is national. No school is bigger than 500. It's 6 to 16, which means it's only 2 forms of entry. It has features within it which are around relationships and are critical to relationships. It is not preoccupied with assessment and standards, and in fact when the youngsters get their standards they become the property of the youngster, not of the state. So they're a very good model to look at. But in the States there's a huge amount of change going on, where small schools are being developed and large schools are being restructured as schools within schools. In Boston there's something like 30 pilot small schools now established, and in New York, with money from the Gates Foundation, I think there's now 150 small schools of choice. There's probably one large American school being restructured a week in the States.
And that's all state schools, that's not private schools?
No, they're all state schools. And here, of course, what we've done with huge amounts of money under the Blair government was to rebuild our schools, but to rebuild them on a scale and the size that existed before, if not bigger, and actually we failed to redesign what goes on inside the schools that would reconnect with young people.
We're too concerned with the hard structures rather than the...
Well, we're not concerned with the kind of design principles that human scale would argue for. Fewer relationships for teachers to make with children, for youngsters themselves perhaps to have just 6 teachers a week instead of 15, and then of course the additional ones that come through supply and absence and so on, that we need to create communities of teachers who have time to sit together, think together about children. We need to promote student voice in our schools. We need to give youngsters an experience of community they can take into their adult lives. And I don't think you can do that on a large scale. My experience is that necessarily you reach for systems and processes that make it difficult.